first, I would like to explain why I'm interested in the restlessness in Hegel, in this topic of thought motive or notion, not to say concept, maybe it's not a concept of Unruhe or signal word Unruhe. Second, I would like to look through some interpretation of this Unruhe in Hegel and look at these quotations in Hegel and also discuss his understanding of Hegel's, in the sense, in general idea of dialectics, and then try to attempt some synthesis, or maybe just return to, in Hegelian way, to return to my initial points. So it's also, my interest is not like kind of intellectual history or history of philosophy only, though, of course, I very appreciate these sort of historical studies, but rather kind of genealogy in Foucault's sense. So it's not studies for the sake of a study of this historical material, but also rather responding to some problem in the present we have today. So and the problem, name of this problem for me, I was also my another book project besides this one I'm submitting to Bloomsbury is called Continual Condition. It's a title of a poem by an American poet. And this is about this sort of kind of predicament of contemporary capitalism, which is somehow based on this continuous production, continuity as a kind of its core element. Continuity in the sense also, that's why restlessness, which is quite close to idea of continuous incessant activity. That's why I was thinking about these terms about Hegel as well. And when I thought about what I can do for this conference, I thought about this. So it's a kind of paradigm of incessant interrupted activity, which is a kind of, in my view, is somehow very prevalent in today kind of hectic, never stopping social production, not just production in the sense of material production, but social production. And I just try to produce for my other book project this sort of kind of philosophical genealogy of this paradigm of incessant activity and uninterrupted activity, even looking sort of political theology as well, and political economy, and trying to locate these kind of concept in Marx as well. So it's a kind of, also I mentioned this today, it's a kind of dialectic without outcome of resultat, only kind of performance, which is spreads through media, through kind of performative, this performative element which Katie was talking about. So process-based kind of society, which is completely absorbed by this processual kind of circulation, constant movement, and what I would call also kind of societal performance. We're going to talk about this today, continuous performance. So it's enough sociological symptoms like, of course, this constant circulation of information, commodity was already reflected and discussed in some books in cultural studies, anthropology, and so on, but not much in the sense of this consistent genealogy. For example, there is a famous book by Jonathan Craig, 24/7, about this sort of continuous capitalism, but not in the sense of kind of producing philosophical genealogy of this predicament. So also today, some theorists, I was thinking about, theorists talk about this sort of kind of provocative way, like my comrade George about this new feudalism, where also element of performance gets into the stage very boldly, because it's based on service work, predominance of service work, constant service, which is also kind of continuous performance, right? So kind of continuous providing services is sort of neo-feudal or neoliberal kind of focus on service work, which is also continuous performance, which actually interestingly makes, again, actual Hegel dialectics of master and the slave, which is, I think, interesting point to make, because what of master and servant relations in today kind of economy. So so this sort of kind of continue, but of course, even in a real feudal society, it was also kind of important. So continuity could extend even beyond this capitalist modernity, because it was always somehow continuity presumed, for example, in political theology, because continuity of power, continuity of monarchical succession, for example. If you read Ernst Kantorowicz, Double Body of the King, exactly his idea of double body of the king means a second immortal body provides continuity of power. And of course, you can say in modernity, it was somehow this continuity was somehow taken by other means. With advance of capital, this continuity means rather something which is embedded not in this kind of symbolic continuity of monarchical power, but rather in kind of efficient, performative continuity of power, which somehow never stops, never ceases to function or perform. So, and today, again, again, it's not the focus, returning to today's condition, it's not the focus on kind of productivity, like classical type, produce more, but rather perform more, so to deploy our activity even more than before. So that's why I talk about this kind of continual condition, and referring to yesterday talk about Adorno by Weber, it's also about this sort of mute compulsion. We mean this recent book by Soren Mao, who talks about this sort of power of capitalism somehow, which is in a way mute compulsion, which is silent compulsion, which is not kind of something, but it's still very compulsion which is continuous. So it's very important to stress a compulsion which is never stops. It's a compulsion which is never stopping compulsion. And I already published some chapter on this kind of thing in basically drawing on the text of Marx, Unruhe, where he talks that basically about continuität in German as a part of the very concept of capital, right? So he says, for example, constant continuity of the process, abstracted fluid transition of value from one form to another, or from one phase of the process into the next, appears as fundamental condition of production based on capital. To a much greater degree than all earlier forms of production, so feudal or classical. So basically, and Marx deploys this idea of continuity on various levels, continuity of production, because obviously he refers to fixed capital machines, because if you stop the machine, you ruin the value, because the machine is not functioning, it's not producing new value. Right. He also talks about continuity of circulation, and very subtle moment talks about continuity of credit, which means that you can always borrow to resume the process. So the credit system is also based on this idea of providing continuity. So, and avoiding contingency, which is also very important, that contingency somehow disrupts continuity, but there is a credit system which always to recuperate, to somehow provide a smoother functioning, advancing some money, just to renew the process of production. So these are three aspects which I discuss in my published work. So, and also I was just mentioning this continuity of power in modernity, which I also talk about this through Foucault work, because obviously his idea of changing the model of power from sovereign power, monarchical rule, to modern power based on invisible, also mute compulsion of various techniques of power, technologies of power, is also somehow based on idea of continuity, in my view, because Foucault talks about power is immanent. So power is in a social body and it's always active. So it's not that monarch which somehow appears and then disappears in public. So for example, for Hobbes, if you read Hobbes' Leviathan, there is a very funny idea that what happens to monarch when he is asleep, right? So where is power? So when monarch is sleeping, nobody knows. So this sort of also dangerous for continuity of power. And there is a whole pages when he tries to solve this problem, and that's why the whole idea of representation emerges of this, because power should be delegated to somebody while monarch is sleeping. That's why the whole idea of executive power emerges from this contingent interruption based on human topological constituencies and this need for sleep. So this somehow for Foucault, obviously, power is he will use the word continuum, carceral continuum, administrative continuum. Obviously, refers to this continuity on many occasions, but not systematically, like focusing this on this explicitly. And even more, in his idea of biopolitics, Foucault basically talks about the power. It's not just a continuity which of smooth operation, but its power forcing individuals to get into this continuum. Like it's a forcing continuity which somehow injunction to leave, basically, because for Foucault he talks about the power of faire vivre. So power makes us leave to continue, right? So this is the kind of this concept of biopolitics. So this continuity is also, in my view, aligned with this sort of Marxist line of analysis of capital. So and even more to be more kind of even ambitious, here we could also talk about this, like yesterday in this talk about is that kind of Adorno's critique of Heidegger ontology, just basically leads to the point that Heidegger basically naturalized this historical condition created by capitalism, right? So in kind of the second nature, whatever. But it's more interesting to think even from other perspective, like that there is something in ontological before even this sort of modernity or capitalist modernity be somehow relevant for this. So there may be not just saying that it's ontology, social ontology of capitalism, but there is something in ontological which somehow based on this idea of pressuring being, which is restless, which is somehow forcing to be, right? And this is other part of my kind of genealogy, which I worked through some other texts, which I think don't have time to go through now. So it also leads to kind of idea that sort of fatality of being, which somehow imprinted in being itself. So, and that's why these images like Benjamin image of locomotive of history, which somehow goes and goes, and you need to find a stop, kind of stop handle, stopping handle to stop this kind of merciless movement. Or in other texts, Benjamin calls this monstrous, ungeheure Bewegung, I think in German, like monstrous movement of modernity. Just as a kind of symbolizing this moment of pressure of kind of big. So, and even interestingly, because it's another digression, because sorry, I got these notes. And when I was always interested in marginalia, and now finally approaching to Hegel, there is an interesting summary of phenomenology of spirit, which he was asked to produce for commercial kind of purposes, just as a book advertising, because you know, phenomenology of spirit is a very, very complex work. Which is legendary difficult to read. And can you imagine, I was asked to produce an abstract for this work for one paragraph. And in this abstract, he actually talks about also something related to locomotive of history, because he says almost explicitly, like the spirit moves from one station to another. Basically, if you read this text of this very marginal text of Hegel, who gave this sort of popular explanation, what is this? Try to use this metaphor like station, moving from one station to another. Like already this train rail system was already present in some early 19th century in England, I think. So he could have an idea of this moving locomotive of history. So, and I still think that this, whatever it could be debatable about this ontological moment, and is it just about specific historical ontology of capitalism, or there is some kind of an ontology which somehow could be expressed in this sort of capitalism, but whatever way we could also talk about other kind of forms of communist forms of expression of the same ontologies, trying to counteract on this sort of pressure, historical pressure. And that's why I think in many ways Soviet experience economy was dysfunctional. Planet economy was not about planning or production. It was about making everything very slow and less pressuring. And also, so my genealogy also talks not just about this machinery of history or machinery of power or machinery, which is in factories, Marx talking about this, but also kind of conceptual machinery, which is somehow implies these kind of forms which somehow related to this forced continuity of capitalist modernity. So, for example, the same I think Ray was talking yesterday about Kant's mentioning through Adorno, this Kant's subsumption of sensory data to concept, which is a constant machinery which somehow moves on, and this is somehow, according to Kant's model, embedded in our mind, right? So I was curious about this sort of conceptual machinery, which already has this sort of anticipation, prefiguration of this continuous order of socialized life under late capitalization became more and more obvious today. So you can read it in many classical early modern philosophers, for example, for Descartes, basically for his idea that thinking is a substance, it means that we have to think constantly, permanently, never stopping, because the only attribute of this substance is thinking. So if you stop thinking, you cease to exist. So basically, he says more or less explicitly in this one of his fragments from this Discourse of Method, I think. So many other ways to approach different authors in this kind of genealogy, like Leibniz' principle of continuity explicitly formulates this logic as well, or ontological logic, because for Leibniz it was ontology continuous, so it's like about being. Talking also about these models of kind of permanent activity, I was attracted by these debates about various forms of kind of opposing this model, such as, for example, this proposal of inoperativity, which was propagated by Agamben, which is actually not his original idea, but comes from exactly from Hegel, from debates between Kajev and Bataille in the 50s, which was also linked to Kajev's reading of Hegel philosophy and dialectics as a kind of philosophy after the end of history, after the dialectic is stopped. That's why also somehow I try to relate it to the topic of dialectics and anti-dialectics today, because what means Kashevian reading of Hegel, if not this sort of kind of dialectic which is stopped or already kind of stopped operating, which is quite a provocative idea, which was discussed, of course, many debates. But in my context, I'm interested in this sort of as a kind of dialectic which is somehow deactivated, something like this. So this is just to outline the scope of why I'm interested in this sort of restlessness in Hegel. That's my first part of what I'm talking here. And again, return to maybe to one, just one another point which I wanted to make, that this sort of performative model was also, in my view, somehow expressed also in politics, because in a way today, especially today, because, and also has aesthetics aspects, because we're always dealing with this sort of performance which has kind of no conclusions. Again, no result, no outcome, which somehow can be interrupted at any moment. So it just basically some processual activity like occupying the square, for example, happens, but then it's suddenly occupation is evicted, then it appears in another place. That was like 10 years ago, because it's now not relevant for today, but this sort of processual, so it wasn't exactly these debates about programmatism or anti-programmatism, insurrectionism in this context. Do we need a program or not? Do we need a goal, basically? And that's why also this is very relevant, because if the historical dialectics, if we, for a moment, of course, so just hypothetically talking about Kashev ideal end of dialectic as a kind of teleological process, we did have today a lot of these non-teleological processes also in art, obviously performative art, which also has no kind of culmination or it's rather anti-culmination, when you have performance which unfolds and then stops without a kind of result, except of maybe recording of this performance and So this is those things which I was really captivated. So talking, this is what my kind of first part of my reflections about continuity and how related to restlessness. So I'm interested in restlessness per se because not just restlessness of the negative, but restlessness is a kind of strange moment in this is also aligned with Antonio, who is looking about this kind of disorder in dialectics, something non-dialectical in dialectics, and also another paper was by Alexei, I think, was looking at this non-dialectical in dialectics, and this is also kind of form of excess of negativity, right? This restlessness, surplus negativity, something, but at the same time, for me, it's also something anomalous in the sense that being kind of symptom in Hegel's signal word about the sort of ontological dispositive of modernity, right? There, to quote it. So this is kind of distortion which comes externally as reflecting this sort of ontological pressure of modernity, maybe, hypothesis, maybe not. Dialectics in Hegel, I was just decided to reread what just thinking about dialectics in Hegel in general. I just basically interestingly that Hegel never talks about dialectics directly, right? So he talks about dialectical. He talks. There are some several paragraphs on dialectics in Introduction to Science of Logic. There is finally one paragraph in Encyclopedia, paragraph 81, in first volume of Encyclopedia, where Hegel discusses thematized dialectic, talks about what dialectic is, explains what it is. So, and it's also interesting and symptomatic that you can find some here and there how Hegel defines dialectics, but it's not many of these passages. So, and he says, I'm quoting that with the dialectics is basically one side of the logical. He says with regard to its form, the logical has three sides: the side of abstraction, of understanding. I think it's Verstand in German. And that's why Hegel always criticized abstraction and always talks that dialectics somehow fills abstraction with the concrete. So dialectics, or second point is that side of logical is exactly what he called dialectical or negatively rational side, he says. And third point is speculative or positively rational side. That's why I think it was a very good paper by Jan Polker about speculative, when he used the example of speculative sentence, strictly saying it's not dialectical because it's what Hegel calls speculative. So dialectics has this being one of the moments, again, three moments of the logical, second moment. So and dialectics that's why again here implicitly the topic of restlessness emerges. He says that dialectics, on the contrary, is opposing it to Verstand, this understanding, is immanent transcending in which one-sidedness and restrictedness of determinations of understanding displays itself as what it is. That is as their negation. That is what everything finite is, its own sublation. So, and this is that exactly at this moment which Hegel usually appears this topic of restlessness. So restless sublation of the finite, which is not fixed. It's always basically between being and non-being, and somehow dissolving into the next moment. So the restless sublation or negation of the finite. So finite has to be transcended by in this sort of dialectical infinite moment. So another quotation from the same paragraph I think is important because Hegel here talks about that omnipotence of dialectics. Also very interestingly, which I think is very symptomatic. Hegel says that everything around us can be regarded as example of dialectics. In this sense, because it was also a discussion of Stalinist diamond here, Hegel is not very far in this respect, because he talks that, yes, dialectic is omnipotent, is everywhere. He talks about celestial bodies, planets, chemistry, mechanics everywhere, exactly like in this sort of Stalinist interpretation of dialectics. But with one subtle nuance, that if you read, for example, beginning introductory chapter of Philosophy of Nature in Hegel, which is, I think, a very interesting book, he talks about, there is a subtle twist in it. So it's not unproblematic kind of power of dialectic over nature. It's exactly crisis, because externalization of idea in the nature somehow the most critical and most crisis-ridden process in the whole 3 volumes of the encyclopedia, because it even has, he talks about exactly Ohnmacht or powerlessness or impotency of nature, which is not able to somehow respond and obey dialectical kind of moments. Dialectics as a form of this omnipotence of dialectics somehow collapses in the nature. And there are some even beautiful Nietzschean pages in opening paragraphs of the Philosophy of Nature, where Hegel talks about Bachian kind of drunkenness of idea, which found itself in the nature, like beautiful passages. I don't have time to read them. So somehow ideas kind of like Bacchanian, intoxicated. He used the word intoxicated as also in phenomenology, but in different contexts. Intoxication of idea, but it's different intoxication than in phenomenology of spirit. It's intoxication, but which negative one, like drunkenness, bad one, not intoxication. Intoxication with truth, like in phenomenology of spirit. He used the same image. So, so I found this all very interesting, and this is kind of important statement. So I will read this omnipotence of dialectic statement, which is, I think, is very, very important. We must now add that the principle of dialectic is the same objective sense corresponds to the notion of God's might. So it's a kind of has theological aspect. So we say that all things, that everything finite as such, come to judgment. Urteil, I think in German, Urteil means also judging all finite, because judgment in the sense of sentence, juridical sentence, you are finite, you have to die, in this sense. If you are mortal, you have to die, it's your judgment. This also implying this theological element. So and continue the quotation. And in what's saying, we catch sight of the dialectics as a universal, irresistible macht, before which nothing can subsist, however firm and secure it may deem itself to be. So this determination certainly does not exhaust the depths of the divine essence, he says, the concept of God, but it still forms an essential moment in all religious consciousness. So this is I think, also fascinating in his, for me at least, and his attempt, Hegel's attempt to define dialectics as a kind of omnipotency, even divine potency. So exactly as a way of kind of managing dialectical kind of managing also through these dialectical moments, right? So and that's why obviously all critiques like Adornian critique of dialectic is not only focused on the idea of totalizing synthesis, which always repressive, but also this sort of ongoing kind of dialectical process, which is somehow imposes itself on, like imposes itself on nature, for example, if you read, as I mentioned, this volume on Philosophy of Nature. So dialectics in this sense is a kind of even power, dispositive of power. That's why I'm interested in this sort of ontological moment of dialectics being a kind of, for Hegel, a kind of power arrangement, right? So which somehow, of course, later was contested by Marx, who criticized the sort of idealist theological side of dialectics, or then Adorno and many others. But I think it's important to keep this sort of initial statement on dialectics. So in my sense, that's why I think, because God is definitely leads us to ontology, or rather metaphysics, and we distinguish this ontology and metaphysics, exactly as a kind of form of power, which somehow, in my view, should be contextualized in this context of modernity, which I outlined in the first part of my talk. So, and here also, that's why all these proposals, I think, are important. Proposals about deactivation of dialectics. And for example, this another provocation of Kojève I mentioned, it was to say that basically Hegel is not a dialectical thinker, that Hegel is just registered the process which already finished. That's why he called it phenomenology, not dialectics of spirit, phenomenology of spirit. And the dialectic is in the real, but at the moment Hegel starts his philosophy, exactly the dialectics is already finished. That's why this all of Minerva and all these things. So it's Kojève's point, which might be provocative and might also disagree with that history has already totalized itself in 19th century, obviously not, but this was a very important point of trying to subvert this sort of dialectical dispositive, but just by sheer claiming that it's already stopped. So yes, it might be powerful dispositive, but it doesn't work anymore. Something which I think is extremely original and is interesting in this context. So something which is already not working, right? So, and then, so after outlining what I try to reconstruct as sort of how Hegel presented dialectics, thematized dialectics, I just wanted to focus a little bit on this restlessness. And obviously, actually, the first time it was Alexander Koyré, who also influenced Kojève, of course, on Hegel, obviously, and basically even gave him this job of teaching in this course, because Kojève was somewhere on leave or something, teaching somewhere else. So it was published in 1934, and one of the interesting points he makes there is exactly about this restlessness. So that's why I was reading recently this his article, which was very influential in many ways. And also Derrida was referring to this as a source of course, some of his different ideal difference. So it was very influential, but I'm interested in this, is emphasizing of this restlessness, or Unruhe in German, or das Unruhige, Hegel uses another expression. Koyré was mostly referring to passages from Hegel from his early works, like Jena appeared in Ienes and Logik in German, and where he talks about absolute Unruhe, or Unruhe des absoluten Begriffs, unrest, restlessness of absolute concept, in his discussion of exactly this relations between finite and infinite, and in this textual evidence shows. So, in encyclopedia, you also talk, talking about not what with which Koyré was working, but was focusing mostly on early Hegel's text. But if you look at encyclopedia, late Hegel's text, you can also find some symptomatic expressions about Unruhe, which is when from Encyclopedia Logic, when he talks about the category of becoming, he says, at their unity, becoming is a true expression of result of being and nothing. It is not only unity of being and nothing, but unrest in itself, Unruhe an sich, in sich. The unity that as a relation to itself is not merely immobile, but within itself, against itself, on account of difference of being and nothing contained in it. So this, he talks about Unruhe in itself. in this passage, which is important. So we can see continuity early Hegel, which uses this expression very often in his early writing, but also in his late writing. He retains some elements more rarely, not as frequently, of this Unruhe. So Korea was actually half of his article consists of his own translation from Hegel, which, as he says, a kind of, he confesses I translated them, but I'm not still completely understand what I'm translated. He makes this sort of joke. It looks like a sorcery or kind of magical tricks for him, but he points out this motive of restlessness as one of the most important in Hegel, and talks exactly that heart of the, I quote, the heart of dialectics is, I skip some bits of the sentence, heart of dialectics is in the relation of the finite and infinite themselves. Hegel strives to make us see the unrest of all infinite, of all determination, of all limitation, which negatively as such sublimates itself, necessarily posing that towards which it is defined, delimited, determined, or de-infinited, necessarily negating this limit, this term, this age, and thus transforming itself into infinite, unlimited, or indeterminate. So this is one of, so for him, this dialectic, heart of dialectic is this relation between finite and infinite, and he says finite being is not being ether. It is a movement precisely because it is not what it pretends to be, precisely because it is other than what it is not. So these are some, just to give you a sense of this, his reading of Hegel's restlessness, or as a relation between infinite and finite, and it's like infinite is in constant crisis, in constant kind of falling apart, basically, because of this relation to infinite, which is very important. So infinite is immanent, so infinite is not something there, transcendent, but infinite is here. That's why it undermines finite all the time. So it's that's why restlessness somehow emerged, because infinite is here, right here. So it undermines here and now, every moment undermines all finite. So you can read this passage like this. So, and that's why he says, which a beautiful sentence, which he leaves without comment, saying that unrest is the heart of being. Inquietude est le fond de l'être. Inquietude, my French pronunciation is horrible. So is it the form or base or heart of being? So and then he continues, the finite and the infinite pursue each other and ruin each other, which is also beautiful. So it's not only finite affected by infinite, but infinite is also affected by finite. It's also important moment. So infinite is also in unrest because of this relation to finite. So it's always like you're constantly busy with all these finite things. Yeah, so because as they are only themselves in relation to each other, he says. So finite and infinite. So I think this is a very important statement, which I'm I think somehow for this specific episode, but also for my general attempt to understand unrest as a part of this ontological kind of dispositive, like dialectic is a kind of powerful side, like the side of power, like dispositive, which pushes everything into this kind of restlessness and expressing the same itself, ontological restlessness or modernity, perhaps. And then I found some other course interpretation of this restlessness. One of the things which I found just recently preparing this paper was interestingly early book by Herbert Marcuse, written in 1932, titled Hegel Ontology and Theory of Historicity. It was published in 32, even before Koyré paper, and also draws on early Hegel's text, Jena text, and also somehow claims on many occasions this issue of restlessness. But this is somehow linked to Marcuse's overall interpretation of Hegel ontology, which is quite unorthodox and focused exactly on this movement or restlessness, basically, or he calls it, English translation is motility, like Bewegtheit, original term is Bewegtheit, like motility, this sort of. And for him, Hegel's ontology, he tries to follow, deconstruct, is somehow linked to his concept of life. Because obviously most of interpretations, they go to the logical side of Hegel, but he focuses on this kind of Hegel's fascination with life and as a process which, teleological process which somehow unfolds idea, and he says it also in philosophy of nature, that first real kind of realization of ideas, living being, right? So it's where idea finds its own integrity or totality of living organism. So so for him, and this is linked to this kind of interesting interpretation of Hegel ontology from the point of view of the concept of life. And today there is other attempts to read it in this way. For example, Karen Inge book, Concept of Life in Hegel, where she talks more about his relation to Kant, idea of teleology. But it's also interesting book, but it's more technical, more historical, philosophical. But Marcuse obviously was also like very influenced by Heidegger. That's why his interest in ontology, his interest in this historicity at this time in the 30s, where Heidegger became big in Europe. And so this is an important other facet of this Unruhe thing. This sort of also in philosophy of nature. Hegel talks about Unruhe in relation to blood circulation, for example, this living organism circulation, so circulation of blood and beating of heart. So this sort of Unruhe is somehow penetrates life. And also in third volume of Encyclopedia, he talks actually about, very interestingly, the author who proposed Foucault and Agamben talk about biopolitics, Bichat, who French physiologist who introduced this division between organic and animal life. So organic life is just pure reproduction of our body, and animal life is motility, exactly movement of the organism. And both Foucault talks about Bichat and his archaeology of clinic, and Agamben talks about Bichat in his book on animal, for example. So Hegel also tackles this sort of biopolitical aspect of modernity, maybe implicitly, which follows from more contemporary reading. And finally, Nancy, I think it was important aspect he tackles in also talking about this kind of incessant character of restlessness, emphasizing this sort of incessancy of restlessness. So where he talks, for example, just try to find quotation. So about living restlessness of subject, its own concrete effectivity. He's written about Hegel. And he describes restlessness as incessant movement and activity, kind of also even non-teleological, without kind of beginning and end, just restlessness in itself, like an sich. So it's even can be understood even without this topic of negativity, I think, as exactly this process restlessness itself. And reading of Nancy means so. And also, it's interesting that in a way, this restlessness in dialectics, I think somebody already referred to speculative remark when Nancy. He has there a very interesting reading of also related to this incessancy and opposite to what is opposite to restlessness, kind of relief. And that's why he also mentions a kind of relief, which in relation to supplation. So supplation somehow relieves restlessness in his reading. French or Level, and relief could have this meaning very marginally of relief, like relaxation of this restless activity. So this Aufhebung is in a way relief, this restlessness, if you can read it from this perspective. So I think this is also important to emphasize in Nancy. So basically this was, I don't know how much time, it's still, sure. So yes, so the other part of my trying to understand Hegel and restlessness and beyond was exactly thinking about some other kind of concepts which would be close located in maybe even in early modern philosophy before Hegel. So that's why, just to mention this very briefly, I think you can establish a kind of continuity between, for example, Locke's notion of uneasiness in his essays of human understanding. Leibniz also used this inquietude in his kind of psychology, but also ontologically, it's important, this sort of constant restlessness. And if you read, for example, Deleuze, Fold, that he emphasizes universal restlessness or inquietude. In Leibniz, who was definitely not focused on negativity, right? So this restlessness as inquietude somehow functions behind this sort of mechanism, negativity dialectics in this sense. So, so also you can find continuation of this line of kind of restlessness, which somehow linked to modernity and its own kind of ontological restlessness. And also there is a very beautiful book on Leibniz, which I like, by Jun Elster, which somehow talks about Leibniz and spirit of capitalism. And he exactly reads this restlessness because for Leibniz, his psychology, to put it very simply, is that we are restless and in a way looking for increasing our what he calls felicité, like well-being and happiness. And Elster, to quote my English translation from French, because this book is not translated into English, that capital is immanent. So he reads, of course, he has this sort of Marxist, Weberian, even not just Marxist, but Marx and Weber reading of Leibniz as a kind of relating him to spirit of capitalism, more Weber expression than Marx. And he says, a very interesting emphasizes that he tries to read his restlessness as restlessness of capital. And he says, capital and immanent restlessness, a constant tendency to surpass itself, to separate or transcend itself, lives only in the process of growth and accumulation that allows us to free itself from bad infinity of circulation. This is one of the passages he uses there. So he tried to also to link Leibniz restlessness to restlessness, this sense of restlessness of capital. So, and also to return to the beginning of my point, I already mentioned Deleuze and Foucault in this context. So they both somehow, of course, Foucault in his theory of power, or Deleuze in his reading of early modern philosophers, they obviously, of course, they somehow deflect and interpret or read this classical text, or read, as Foucault, read historical archive as through this articulation of power. But still, I think they both somehow, and both of Deleuze and Foucault mentioned them as anti-dialecticians, both of them still, how to say, emphasize this restlessness, because for Foucault, obviously his ontology, his knowledge of relations of various forces, obviously they are in constant movement. He always emphasize these, not just in his analysis of power, but through Nietzsche, obviously. So this restlessness was somehow, or inquietude, somehow present in this anti-dialectic, which I was just thinking about, an anti-dialectical sort as well. And Deleuze, obviously, for him, notion of becoming is the same restless as becoming in Hegel. So just yeah, a few concluding points. And finally, for Marx, I was thinking how Marx, besides this concept of continuity, which we can find in Grundrisse and published some analysis of it. He also talks about, I was thinking about Unruhe, and he also talks about Unruhe in relation to labor. For him, when he tries to describe process of labor process, he always, not always, but quite often refers it as productive Unruhe or schaffenden, creative Unruhe. So this could be written different ways, of course, not like also Marx was probably affected by the whole paradigm of activity, and obviously this idea of constant social production and reproduction also reflects this sort of the same restlessness. Because if you stop production, it's like in theology, like God created the world, but what to do next? Because you need to maintain. And so if you withdraw your power, you might and everything falls apart. So there is also this kind of theological model of creative continuous creation, for example, when there is an idea that you need a constant support for this production process. And Leibniz, for example, translate continuous creation as continuous production, continuous production. But it's another footnote on this. So I will probably end on this tangent of everything a little bit